How many times can you say that you've been tempted? A lot. That's probably, yeah. Well, temptation and that appearance of evil that I'm talking about are probably the two toughest things for Christians to deal with. You know, I studied one time, I read a thing that said the easiest thing to do is to become a Christian. The hardest thing to do is be a Christian. To live that life of being a Christian. It's difficult sometimes. And so the temptations and the appearances of evil that come about in life are those things that make it hard for us. I'm sure when we got saved, we thought, well, it's supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be easy. It's not necessarily the way it is, right? Actually, as Christians, we probably deal with more temptations. Maybe not more, but we deal with them in a different way. Let's try it that way. Than the average person in the world does. We have to be more cautious of the things that we do in life because we are a witness to Christ in all that we do, and people are watching us. We forget that we're being watched. But we're always being watched. You know, every time you think about something that you've done that you know you probably shouldn't have done, gone somewhere you knew you shouldn't have gone, is that you're like, nobody's around. I'm going to go to this place because nobody ever goes there, right? Nobody I know will be there. And you sit down and you look around and it's like, uh-oh, I know them. Now I'm stuck. Face gets red. I am in trouble. I know that person. That one person might not be from my church. Might be somebody I've been talking to at work about Christ. And they say, I see how you Christians are. I got y'all. You want me to do that? Why? Why? But even so, remember, when no one is looking, God's seeing everything. You know, in my job, a lot of times people will stop and watch what they say because it's me. Well, we know you. You were a chaplain for a little while. You're a preacher. We can't cuss around you. God heard you. It really doesn't matter whether it was around me or not. If you're guilty for it, it's guilty before God, not before me. And that's what we need to remember. We're guilty before God when we do these things. So hopefully through the Bible today I can show us some lessons about temptation, about how real it is, maybe some ways to avoid it, maybe some ways to avoid that appearance of evil. There's all sorts of temptations out there, and what we forget sometimes when we get saved, and I think what a lot of people in the world looking at us Christians forget, is guess what? I wasn't always a Christian. I wasn't always a preacher. There's things from my past that will inevitably creep up into my life today. And anybody here that can't say the same thing is lying. We know that there'll always be something there that's going to creep up. There's all sorts of temptations out there. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. Now I'm just going to read the first half of this verse for you. It says, no temptation has overtaken you except such is common to man. There's no temptation out there that is any different, that is anything new to anybody. Maybe new to you, but it's a common temptation that has been out there from the beginning of time. Believe it or not, pride of life, right? Pride of the flesh. All those go in. What are some of our common temptations we deal with these days? I mean, when this was written 2,000 years ago, things might have been different, but they were still the same, weren't they? What we deal with today? What about people and their bad language? You don't think they cussed back then just because it's not written in the Bible? Jesus says, call no man raka, which means fool. It was using bad language. It was a bad attitude, a bad way to talk to people. Has that changed? We might have come up with some different words for it, different ways of saying it, but it's still the same, isn't it? I grew up in a household full of people who cussed. Needless to say, guess what? I learned to cuss with the best of them. I joined the army. Well, they taught me a few more that I didn't know. I learned that behavior. And when I surrendered to preach, I was like, I can't live like this. I can't talk like this. I've got to do something about it. I've got to change it. And over some time, it's gotten a lot better. You want me to lie to you and say I've never cussed? No. When I get angry, when I get mad, you don't think those same thoughts come through my mind that they did 20 years ago? I used to drink. You've heard Brother Tim talk about it. People who used to drink, especially drink a lot, are really tempted to drink again, aren't they? And it never fails. You'll walk out to the neighbor's house, mowing the yard, you're all hot and sweaty. He walks out with that ice cold beer, and you're thinking, oh, I remember those days. But you can't do it. You can't do it. You think you can. Nobody's looking, just me and my neighbor. It'll be okay. Deacon turns around the corner. Never fails. What about going places? Are there places that we as Christians should not be seen at? When we go to those places, we're tempted back into our old life. We're tempted to do the things that we used to do, aren't we? Is temptation a new thing? So why is it as Christians we think that we're not going to have to deal with it? Why do we think that when we sit there and we say, Lord, forgive me of my sins, I know I'm a sinner, I want to be saved, that it's all going to change? Why do we think that? Do we have examples in the Bible that says, hey, it all gets better when you get saved? Or do we have examples in the Bible that it continues and maybe even gets a little bit worse? What examples can we look for? In Luke chapter 20 and verse 22, Luke 22 and verse 40. I got my page marker in the wrong spot. Luke chapter 22 and verse 40. Jesus is talking to his disciples here. These guys that had walked with him for 3 years, right? They had seen all the miracles that he's performed, right? Oh, my wife's going to be mad because she told me I could not say right. It's called a crutch word. These guys had seen the miracles. Some of them took part in performing these miracles. They came to Jesus on one occasion and said, look, we couldn't cast this one out. We tried everything. And he said, you didn't have enough faith. So we know that they were performing miracles too, right? Correct? Sometimes right is just the right word. I'm sorry. But what does Jesus say to his disciples that should know everything by now? Pray that you may not enter into temptation. Pray that you may not enter into temptation. He knew that they were going to be tempted. He knew that they, at their level of study and fellowship and faith with him, would be tempted. When Jesus was arrested, he told Peter that 3 times you'll deny me. 3 times before the cock crows. You don't think that was temptation? He was very tempted to deny that he even knew Christ 3 times. Temptation. To the best of them. To the best of them. What about Jesus? Jesus get tempted? Was Jesus ever tempted? I mean, he was perfect, right? He was perfect. But was Jesus tempted? How else could he say that he was tempted as all men, yet was sinless, right? In Matthew chapter 4, in verse 1. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted. Jesus was led up into the wilderness to be tempted. During this time, he was tempted in many different ways, wasn't he? We'll talk about that again in a little bit. Jesus was tempted. What makes you think that you're any better? We are all tempted. It's a question of what we do with that temptation. We were talking in our Sunday school class this morning about how that temptation is what leads to sin. It's the temptation that leads to sin. So, when we do fall into that temptation, when we do sin, who do we blame? Who is the first one that comes to mind? Most of us want to blame the devil. A lot of people will say, well, God had me do that. It was a test to see if I could do better. You heard that? Have you ever heard someone tell you, well, God was just testing me and I didn't pass his test? I've heard that. I've said that. I've questioned that. Who do we blame? So many times people want to blame God for everything that goes wrong. So that temptation is also included in that, isn't it? In James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. James, being the brother of Christ, might have had a little insight, though he didn't come to salvation until after the resurrection. A history lesson there. In James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, James writes, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. Don't say that. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. See, being tempted in itself is not bad. Giving in to temptation is bad. Temptations are going to be thrown out there. We need to know to watch for them. We need to know to be strong and avoid them. Who do we blame? The devil made me do it. We can't blame God. Now we got to blame the devil. Devil made me do it. It's kind of clear when you look at the scriptures, looking at Jesus' example back in Matthew. Flip back over there. I should have told y'all to hold your finger on that page. In Matthew chapter 4, it's kind of clear who the tempter is. And so in our life, who is the one that's tempting us? And sometimes he takes different forms. I'm going to read down through verse 11 this time. But listen closely to how it words. It says, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Now when the tempter came, which is who? He came to him and he said, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones become bread." But he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out from the mouth of God." But the devil took him up to the holy city, set him on a pinnacle of the temple, and said unto him, "If thou be the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge over you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said unto him, "It is written again, Ye shall not tempt the Lord your God." And again the devil took him up to an exceeding high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and said to him, "All these things I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and behold, the angels came and ministered. Think about those situations. And just the first one alone just gives me pause. Jesus had fasted for 40 days. He had been in a physical body. So the physical body needed nourishment, no different than ours does. 40 days he hasn't eaten anything. Boy, I really wish I could have a little something to eat right now, he says. Right? That's what he was saying to himself, I'm sure. But he knew he could not be tempted. He could not give in to that temptation. You don't think for that whole 40 days that Jesus knew that he was God and that he was able to do this? But Satan says, "Come on, just a little morsel of bread's all you need. Just a little bit. Just do it. Do it. Prove to me who you are." Tempting him. Taunting him. That was Jesus. Is that not what happens in our lives? People say, "Oh, come on, just a little. One drink's not going to hurt you. It'll be okay. Oh, by the way, I was an alcoholic for 20 years, and now you want to give me one drink. One drink leads to two drinks. Two drinks leads to three drinks. Guess what? I'm alcoholic again." Tempted. Tempted. Just a little. It's all it takes. So who tempted Jesus? Who tempts you? Every temptation that comes out there, I don't care what form it takes, it's coming from Satan. It may be your best friend trying to get you to take a drink or to go to the club with them, but I promise you it's Satan that is the one that's truly tempting. Who do we blame when we fail? When we actually give in to the sin? Who should we blame? What did the Scripture tell us in Corinthians? That second half of that I didn't read to you earlier. No, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. It was in Luke. It was the one in Luke that I had the second half of that I needed to read again, wasn't it? Nope. All right, I'm through with that. I'm going to move on. See, that's what happens sometimes. You get off track. So how do we keep from falling into these temptations? What do we do to stop? What can we do to prevent it? Not to prevent being tempted, but to give in to the temptations. What's some things we can do in our lives that we can change? Simple things, big things. Do just like Jesus did. Go to the Scriptures. Quote the Word of God. Tell Satan to get behind me. Right? He says, get thee behind me, Satan. What did he tell Peter? Here you again. Peter walked with him for 3 years. Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. It don't matter what form it comes in. It's Satan. If it's a temptation to do something wrong, it's Satan. Speak to him. Tell him. My God said, I don't do that. I don't live by bread alone. I don't have to be tempted by these physical desires. I don't have to be. I don't have to be put in some high place and put up on a pedestal to look good. I don't need that crown. I don't need all that glory. God's got all that. That's God's place. Don't put me there. Don't put me in God's place. And another way we can do it is to pray. What did he tell his disciples? Pray that you enter not into temptation. Right? In the Lord's Prayer, what does it say? Lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from evil. Deliver me from evil. Pray. If you find yourself in that spot and you realize, oh, I don't need to do that, Lord. And people say this, right? You hear them say it, oh, Lord, don't let me do it. But they really mean, Lord, don't listen to me say that because I really want to go do it anyways. But it means to sincerely pray, Lord, deliver me from this. Take me away from this temptation. Remove me from this situation. That's what it's talking about. Now back in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the other way that we understand about we don't have to give into this temptation. And if you'll stop and think about any time that you've been tempted, this applies. It says, no temptation is overtaking you except which is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. People like to take that verse and a little out of context. Says God won't put more on you than you can handle. It's not what that's saying. He's saying that I know what you can handle, and I'm going to be there at the end of that to give you another way. Are you going to be willing to take it? See, that's the difference between temptation and sin. When he offers you a different way, are you going to choose it? He gave us free will. He gave us an opportunity to decide for ourselves whether we want to be in fellowship with him or be separated from him. And see, when it says death in the Bible, most of the time that's what it's talking about, is that separation from God. Do you want to be separated from God, from that relationship? Or do you want to be in close proximity to God? When those temptations come up, he is faithful to provide a way out. How many times have you been tempted with something? Rebecca and I have been trying to do that low-carb thing. It hasn't worked, as you can tell, because we're tempted a lot. And at the hospital when I'm working, you know, people always want to show up with donuts. When I've been doing good for almost a week, the longer you do good, the more the tempting it gets, right? For almost a week, I've done really good, and then here they show up with chocolate donuts. But you don't have to eat them. They're even nice enough to go put them in another room. Boy, I'll go find that room. I can smell out a donut. I told Rebecca when I was studying this that I was going to get a chocolate cupcake and put right here and see how tempting it was to everybody. But she figured Brother Tim wouldn't like chocolate on his pulpit when he got home. There's always a way out, right? If we'll take it, if we'll choose it. What's your choice going to be? In James chapter 4 and verse 7. How do we avoid these temptations? How do we do it? James chapter 4 and verse 7. Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. How's it work? Cling to God, resist the devil. When that temptation's in front of you and you know you're not supposed to do this, you say, God, sincerely, God, please just keep me strong. Give me the strength to avoid this. Satan, take that stuff away from me. I don't need that to be happy. I don't need that to be filled with joy because God gives me all of that. You draw nigh to God, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. You know, that's the thing. We was talking about this morning too, about that death, that separation from God. If you think about the story, it says early in the morning that God was walking through the garden, but Adam and Eve hid themselves from God. Who separated themselves from God? Has God ever moved? Has he ever changed his position or his place? No. It's us. When we sin, when we commit sin, we feel guilty, therefore we separate ourselves from God. That's why he doesn't want us to sin, because he doesn't want us to be separated from him. He wants us to be close to him. In that close relationship, he designed it that way. When he created Adam and Eve, he created it so he would have fellowship with them. He walked daily in the garden with them. Every day. Until that day. There's another old story I like to tell about this one, about how God, who separates who. Some of the older people in here might understand this better than the younger people, because almost every truck has a thing in the middle now. But used to, trucks had a bench seat, went all the way across. And teenagers, John Paul, when you was a teenager driving that truck, girlfriend sat right here, hip to hip, arm around her. It's nice. Right? Get married. Next thing you know, she scooted over a little bit. It got too hot in the truck. I don't know. A few years down the road, she's over against the door, hanging her head out the window practically. And he's still sitting there driving. She looks over and says, "Why are you so far away from me?" "I've been in the same place this whole time. Sitting in the driver's seat, waiting on you to come back." That's God. He's sitting in that driver's seat, waiting on us to come back. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that there's the temptation side of this, but there's also the avoiding the appearance of evil. I think a lot of times we think that we can do things and not think about what people are seeing. I talked about that a little bit already, hadn't I? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 22, it says, avoid all evil. In King James Version, it says, avoid the appearance of all evil. I think it's important to know the distinction between the two. I think the two both are correct. We are to avoid all evil, but I think we should also avoid the appearance of the evil. Sometimes it might not be that you're actually doing anything wrong, but you've heard the old saying, being in the wrong place at the right time. See somebody else is right. I get away with it now. What's the Bible tell us about this, though? I think that if we can't look in the Bible and find the answer to these questions, we're just telling everybody our own opinions. When we are talking to people, we need to be able to show them Scripture why I believe what I believe. This is why I do what I do. It's not because somebody told me it was a good thing to do, but because my Bible, the Bible that led me to salvation, that's the one that says I'm not supposed to do this for whatever reason. It may be simple to some, but difficult for others. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 11 through 13. Actually, I think I'm going to back up a little bit and just read a few more verses so we can kind of get a picture of what's going on. So I'm going to start back in about verse 7. I want you to kind of get a picture of what's going on. But again, remember, this was written 2,000 years ago. So the words might mean a little something different to us today. But the gist, the idea of what Paul's trying to say to these people still applies to us. You can change this word to suit whatever fits. And I'll show you how here in just a minute. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, starting in verse 7, it says, however, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some with conscience of the idol unto now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worst. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you, who have knowledge, eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge, you shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when you thus sin against the weak brethren, and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother to stumble. Now, he's talking about food offered to idols. We as Christians know that God cleanses and blesses things for us. And as long as we're not doing it for the purpose, or that was his point to them, as long as you're not eating this for the purpose of honoring that idol. If you take this food and you bless it to God and ask God to cleanse it, then it's acceptable. That's what he was trying to say. But if I'm eating that food and someone shows up that may have just become a convert, doesn't understand that I've already blessed this and it's okay for me to eat it by God's standards, my freedom, my liberty that he gives me, and so they go in and they do it toward the idol instead of toward God. But let's change that. Let's say that, I don't know, big thing going on today is we're going to legalize marijuana. Is marijuana okay? I'm not going to get into that debate with you. Any mind-altering drug that's used outside of prescription, I think, is a problem, but I am not, that's me. If you see someone doing it who is a Christian, they may have their little prescription card, but do you know that? So you decide, well, it's legal for the people who have prescriptions. It'd be good for me. What about pain pills? People do that with pain pills, don't they? Got a bottle of pain pills at the house, and somebody decides, hey, I'm hurting, I'm going to take your pain pills. I take mine the right way. You're taking them because you want to abuse them. What about drinking? What about sitting at a table? Could you imagine going to a dinner party with your coworkers, because this has happened to me, with all your coworkers, 10, 20 people sitting around. Every one of them has a drink in front of them, and you have a glass of water. Somebody comes in from the church, sees you sitting there at that table with all that alcohol. What do they assume? That appearance of evil. You weren't doing it, but it looked like you were. Is it okay to tell your friends, you know what, I can't be around that? Is it okay to tell your friends that this is not okay for me? Might lose a few friends, but you'll save your relationship with God. It'll save a relationship with someone else in the church, hopefully. That's my theory, my opinion. What about having a little drink in public? What you do in your own homes, your own things, between you and God. I've already heard that story 1,000 times. If you're doing it in public, you may be taking one sip out of a glass of wine. Jesus drank wine. I've heard that story. You may just be taking one sip But someone sees you there and says, you know what? That old deacon was drinking him a sip of glass of wine the other day, so it's okay for me to drink. He goes out with his buddies, gets drunk that weekend, decides Sunday morning, I got a hangover, I can't come to church. Did he sin? Did you cause him to sin? Are you guilty for wounding Christ? That's what that scripture is talking about. I'm sorry if it steps on a toe, but that's what that scripture is talking about. That's the truth. We need to avoid all appearances of evil. We don't need people to judge us and see us doing wrong in their eyes. Because what we're trying to do is to teach them about Christ and lead them to Christ. Instead, we're pushing them away and telling them that it's okay to live like the rest of the world because I'm going to live like the rest of the world. Is it okay? No. No. I don't want to be responsible for leading that person down the wrong way. I don't want to be that person. Am I conflicted with temptations? Yes. Just like anybody else here. Do I fail? Sometimes. I do. The same way that you get to that place to where you don't do it is the same way you get past the fact that you did it. And that's through prayer. Come to God. Tell Him, look, you know what? I know I wasn't supposed to do that. I know that I sinned against you, and I know that that wounds you deeply, and I'm sorry. Are you ready to say to God, I'm sorry that I did that? Everyone stand, please. As we go into this time of invitation, I want y'all to consider maybe this is something you've been dealing with. Maybe temptation has been a problem for you in your life. Maybe people in your job or in school or wherever has really been pushing you to do something you know that's not right. Maybe you've been on the internet and the internet is speaking to you in ways that it shouldn't. And you need to ask God for forgiveness. Now's the time for that. Ask Him for strength to get beyond those things. Pray that you do not enter into that temptation, that you don't sin against God. We got somebody to play a little while we do the invitation. He's coming? All right. Altar is open. If it's on your heart, take the time to come. Don't worry about anybody looking at you, judging you, because it's between you and God, and you want to make sure your relationship with Him is what's right. Everyone bow your heads. Close your eyes. Just give us a few minutes here.